we go. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the power of fairy tales and the enchantment, the continued enchantment of them and what's possible with them. And my name's Jackie Bushell, and I don't want to give like a full biography. I mean, that's quite dreary. But what I'd love to do is a little bit of a sense of why these animals, these beasts, I think of fairy tales as like living creatures, because I've discovered that they're not just something that you read and take out a bit of information here or there or critique them. I've found that they engage with you just as much as you engage with them, that they offer a framework of experience to track and trace and ponder your own experiences in life, to offer and to shapeshift deep levels of transformation. But there's a way that I think from where fairy tales have arisen from, those old folklores, the mythic memory within them, that they cross in from the other world, from the mythic realms, and there's an engaging aliveness. There's forces that are touching us through those archetypal energies, and that there's a reciprocity that moves with this. The number of times that I've put on programs for Leah's School of Sacred Storytelling, and then Leah will ring up and say, "Now, what the hell are you running, Jackie? There's all of this, and this happening at the moment. What's the name of that program?" The Tangled Wood. Right, okay, that fits the theme of exactly what's happening. Or what's Wolf Song about? There's this, and this happening. It's like when you touch them, there's Wolf Song is a program that I run, which is about Red Riding Hood, an old, very old version of it, which is, actually, it's a rather dangerous version of Red Riding Hood. Is all sorts of things in it, but and Tangled Wood is a very old version of the Sleeping Beauty, and what happens when we awaken beauty, and what happens when we actually need to retreat from the world and have deep visioning time. The potency of these symbols touches something so deep in our being. The metaphor of the woman in the tower, isolated or deep visionary dreamer, and how fairy tales can bridge both of those things. They can bridge opposites. They can bridge all those aspects of Red Riding Hood, which covers, for example, from I'm aware I'm just diving straight in. I was so excited running this course, but I'll just mention, for example, about Red Riding Hood and what gets bridged there. So, for example, what we've had is girl meets wolf, girl gets eaten by wolf, grandma gets eaten by wolf, no one gets saved. Girl meets wolf, grandma and girl get eaten by wolf, they all get saved. Hero comes in. Girl goes out, gets chatting with wolf, strays from path of virginal virtuosity, gets eaten by wolf, no one gets saved. Girl eats grandma, grandma gets eaten by wolf. Girl sleeps with wolf, and girl outwits wolf and runs home and is well and truly saved. There's all these themes, and all of those themes can hold so many metaphors within them. There's one where girl discovers her own wolfishness and and then goes on to live a bit more of an exciting life. There's the variations that are told over centuries, over millennia, actually, that ring through our culture, and that call something else up, call something up from the chthonic depths of the earth. We can activate parts of archetypes through the fairy tales that we tell, or how we rewrite them. We can implant a greater breadth, post-colonial or feminist or earth-centered breadth into the fairy tales, which lands something into the collective, as well as meeting something in us as well. So we can support their shape shifting by their rewriting, which is what has also been happening over millennia as well. Or we can also utterly manipulate society as well, set down a whole bunch of social mores, morals, and values, which has also been done over hundreds of years. And what I'm going to do today is have a bit of a deep dive into that, from political subversion through to gender politics, becoming a rebel, through to rampant arrogant nationalism and neo-fascist ways of, of of trying to limit your society through not just telling stories, but telling stories that land with great impact in the collective psyche, because they speak in metaphor and they speak in archetypal energies, which are forces that connect beyond, above and beyond. I'll just pop you on mute there. The ordinary 3D realm. They tap us into other realms, which can then bring in this level of breadth and depth. But before I talk any further, it's something I get a little bit passionate about. I'd like to just bring us in a bit together and have a bit of a settling to bring us into the cauldron here today. And seeing there's a small group of us, and I know there's another bunch who are watching later, I'll see if there's any particular questions or threads or paths through the dark forest that you'd like to wander down, so that we can tailor the today as well to anything that you might like to tease out. So settling a check-in with you folks, I'd like to go through some hopefully interesting things around the history of fairy tales, and then dive into a bit of a practical experience to see what you take in for yourself when you connect with the mythic realm and through fairy tales. So that's sort of the rough plan, but as in all the best fairy tales, we can meander down other paths or chat to other wolves along the way. So let's have a little bit of a settle. So I just invite you to be aware of your breath and your belly. Your belly, the root of your belly, the cauldron of your belly, and feeling the warmth in here. This is the place where our deep instinctual wisdom arises from. This is the place that gets activated in so many fairy tales. In my deep listening to myself, what will be the wisest thing to do here? Do I go into that gingerbread house or not? Do I recognize that Granny is looking very, very strange today? That instinctual wisdom that says, get the hell out of there, little girl. Run now. That deep knowing. And touch that, and that is connected down through your legs into the earth, into the land. And just allow the sense of the land that you're sitting on, the land that you live and love on, is holding you, is receiving you. And you're supported. And this earth energy of your land rises up through your body, up through your bones, up through the deep wisdom that is held. The bones are the stones of the body. They're the longest lived part that hold the memory of ages, of ancestors through your being. And allow that earth energy to flow up through your blood, through the rivers and the oceans of your being. Blood carries spirit, carries life force. And up through the energy of your breath that gives rise to voice and inspiration. And the earth energy flowing up to your heart, and the wisdom and the knowing of your heart center, feeling that come online in balance with the cauldron of your belly. And then up higher to your brow and activating your higher intuition. The wisdom of your brow that connects with the heavens and the stars and spirit. So feel your 3 intuitions come online through your body, and supported by the heavens and the earth. And we call upon the wisdom and the medicine of these ancient of ancient tales. These wisdom tales, mystery stories, bawdy, wild, silly, playful, deep, wild earth medicine stories. We call on these as for guidance, for their support, their knowing, and also offer them our love and our new wisdoms and understandings to help shape shift and move the parameters that they were constrained in as well, so they can operate at their fullest in the world. There's a dance of reciprocity between these tales and us. And if you breathe into your beautiful body and breathe out with a sigh on the exhale, and let yourself land here in the cauldron of our group. And a welcome to everybody who's watching on replay as well. And while you're in a quieter space, just have a sense of and a feel into what fairy tales have stuck with you over the years. Doesn't matter whether you love them or hate them. I despise Red Riding Hood. That story has shaped my life so much. And feel the ones that have touched you, or the types of characters that you relate to, the tower princesses, the stepmothers, those tricksy wild cats, the women who can transform into crows, the ones with no hands, the ones who lose their voice for 12 years while they're weaving shirts of nettles for their beloved brothers. When you're ready, just gently opening your eyes. Would you like to share just any fairy tales that have really resonated? You don't need to go into details. It's often very personal how they touch our lives, but any that have resonated with you, or any that you can't stand. That's a resonance in itself. Yeah, just take yourself off mute if any come in. Or Zoe, on, yeah, on.
So I had a book when I was growing up that my dad used to read to me, and it was actually fairy tales written by Terry Jones. I mean, and obviously they were not necessarily some of the fairy tales that he wrote, like they weren't of his creation, but they were like tales of the little corn dolly who the farmer brought into his house, and then she was unhappy with everything, and in his, you know, attempts to make her happy, then, you know, she sort of slowly got moved closer and closer to the fire until eventually she just burst into flames and then disappeared. And so it was, I mean, I obviously also grew up watching a lot of Disney and those sorts of fairy tales, which I had loved as well. But I loved these sort of darker fairy tales and these ones with like, yeah, the whole book is sort of full of those ones. And then more recently, I came across you because I heard you on the Elder Tree podcast.
Yeah.
And I am very interested in herbalism, and I loved the weaving, and that's sort of what I have found more and more of, like this weaving of plants and fairy tales and that sort of thing together. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Oh, welcome.
thank you.
Yes, there's one of the things that I love about these old stories, these folk tales, is that they do weave us into the earth. They're one of the things that it's where humans are decentralized in these stories. It's not always just from an anthropocentric point of view, but there's creatures, there's animals that talk, and nobody blinks an eye at a bird coming down and saying, well, you know, if you do this, this will happen. Or a fox doing this, or ants sorting out little grains for you, or a crow deciding to come in and pluck out the eyes of the evil sister. Just these engagements with nature that are just ordinary, part and parcel. Magic is part and parcel of the everyday world of fairy tales. It's like, there's an old woman who lives in a gingerbread cottage and she casts spells that are really effective. That little dude can spin straw into gold. I mean, what a racket. I'm just imagining the charges that Rumpelstiltskin might get up on today. But yeah, there's this interweaving with the natural world. I think of fairy tales as eco-shamanic tools of engagement, or in these days, re-engagement with nature, and with that, the sense of ourselves as earth, and as back to that dance of reciprocity once more, with plants, with plant spirit, with the way a dead mother can shower her love through a hazel tree and save her daughter. That was the hazel tree, and a little bird singing on it was the original fairy godmother in Cinderella. Fairy godmothers were only really late on the scene. They only really came in, or probably around when fairy tales started becoming literary in around the 1700s. But before then, there weren't really fairies as such in them. They were old women who did magic. And before that, way before that, they were goddesses who did magic. And then the goddesses became women. And then gradually these old women, always single old women who lived by themselves in the forest or on an island in the ocean somewhere, they would do extraordinary magic. Then they became fairies, powerful fairies. Then they became little capricious, flitting fairies who would just cast naughty spells, but they were smallified. They were brought down to tiny size. Then they became fairy godmothers. Yeah, so there's sort of this downgrading. So when you go back to some of the earlier Celtic myths of the shining ones and the fairies, as in capital F-A-E-R-I-E-S, other than little F-A-I-R-I-E-S's, they were powerful sovereign queens of the land. So there's this relationship between that realm of the other world and of the fae, as being the ones who held and anchored the abundance of the land, the sanctity of the land that had lived long enough, eons, or as these old women who had relationships with these shining ones, with these fae, that could help hold the fertility of the land. So there's sort of links back as well to some of these much older mythic tales, like in the Mabinogion or some of the other Celtic yarns. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Why didn't we make this an all-day class? That would be lovely. Yeah, is there anything as well that you'd like to share, Joan or Diana, about any fairy tales that have resonated with you?
As a child, I always loved the princess stories. And I was very interested in like the flying trunk and magic carpets that would fly.
Yes. Oh, can you imagine what that would feel like?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
and trolls underneath the bridge. I thought those are cool too.
yes. Doesn't it just immediately bring us into a world of enchantment?
Yeah.
I don't know how many decades I spent looking to find fairies and cupboards that had no back in them, that would I knew there were other worlds. I just couldn't access them at that age, not until I learned to meditate and to do that dimensional shift. So yes, it just brings us immediately into but that sparking of our imagination into that realm that we know is here somewhere, of magic, absolute pure enchantment that that it's like all it is just like the worlds have got a bit skew with, but we know that it's possible. So there's that engagement with the magic of the forest or the magic of the sea. Yeah. Also, interestingly, a lot of those stories are entwined with some of the other myths or folklore that are legends. The legends of Melusine, that she was a mermaid or a half serpent woman who was a fae, who was a big fairy mama, and that she married one of the counts of, I think it was Poitou, in France. I think they were Poitevin, that then gave rise to the Merovingian king. So there's this whole bunch of folks in France that claim their lineage from the mermaid or the serpent woman Melusine. Similar to in India, there's a whole range of women who down through a matrifocal lineage claim descent from the Nagas, from the serpents, as in a literal descent. The serpent beings gave birth to us. They crossbred with humans, and we carry their lineage in our being. Yeah, so it's sort of interesting, some of these old lore and this mixing. Or I've done a lot of traveling around northern Scotland and reading of really as many old texts as I can find about Selkie lore. It's one of my passions, and they write as if it's true. Or you meet some old woman in the north of the Isle of Lewis. She'll say, oh yeah, my grandma, she knew the McDougalls down the road, and they were of seal folk. They had the webbed fingers. They were descended from seals, because there was a Selkie woman that one of the men slept with back in the 1700s or so, and that lineage, oh, you can never really trust them. Or there's so many stories through Ireland and Scotland of, oh yeah, they were Selkie folk. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It just is. So like it's factual. And it's curious how much fairy tales are synonymous now with fantasy, with untruth. They really took a nosedive from the age of so-called enlightenment, when the rational and the linear and the literal started taking off and suppressing these realms of, I'll just call them, of enchantment, of animism, of earth lore. Same as the rise of medicine as well, the rise of science at that time. So they started then shape-shifting the tales, and I'll get into that shortly. Is there anything that you'd like to add, Diana? Anyone sort of sung to you?
When I was, my mother wasn't all that educated, so books were far and few between. And I didn't read for a long time, but I was born with a couple of birth defects, so I really related to Heidi, the story Heidi. But the other one is, I didn't read books, but I would literally travel out of my body to places. And one of the things that when you talk about the descendants of the Silkies and the mermaids, I grew up believing that I was a mermaid, and I sang. One of my birth defects was a cleft palate, and I couldn't talk, but I started to sing instead. And that's how I healed. Actually, that's how I healed myself, so I can talk now. But the new movie, The Mermaid, is out. And I've seen it twice now. It's like, oh my God, it's so parallel to my life. I love that. When you talk about when I was little, I felt like Cinderella, of course. And my mom favored my sister. So I really felt like Cinderella, because it seemed like I did all the work and she got all the pampering. But also Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And today when you talk about the ones that are, oh, and Vasilisa the Wise, I always felt like my mother was really not my real mother. Like I had another mother, namely Earth Mother. So Vasilisa the Wise, when I found her story, really related to that. But the ones that I hated was Bluebeard. Oh, I hated Bluebeard. I really loved the Red Riding Hood. I just, but I didn't know the darker side of it.
Yes.
I only learned the nicer one.
Yes.
But and also La Llorona, where
Ah,
she drowns her children to get back at the husband. Can't
yes.
stand. I hate that one. I mean, I won't tell that. I'm a professional storyteller, so I tell a lot. And Sealskin, Soulskin, the Silky Tail.
Yes.
And there's a movie called The Secret of Roan Inish. And I've seen it a few times, but now that I'm delving deeper into the mysteries, I saw it more as accurate, like the two families. And in the mermaid, this current mermaid, the original one that I heard of was, sad for her. But the new one, it is a marriage of the families, where his family accepts the, the king.
Mm.
He let her go so she could marry the prince. And in the end, when they sailed off to see the world, the mermaids and the mermen came
Mm.
and right to the shore
Yes.
and
Isn't that
greeted the other family.
fantastic? How they can be rewritten, and then what that lands in the collective of, I mean, isn't that just such a glorious metaphor to come into our world, particularly after the pandemic of I'm right, no, this is the way, no, this is the way, and of families in so many oppositions, and a story that anchors in a union of opposites. It's this coming together that didn't happen through Hans Christian Andersen's story at all, and he brought in a lot of other Christian symbols, but where we go with this, or for example, true love's kiss and having your true shape, such as like in Shrek, where Princess Fiona stays as an ogress. It was like, yes, your true love's shape. What might that actually be? There's flexibility. You don't have to be a pink and white princess. Or Angela Carter wrote one, true love's form in Beauty and the Beast was the woman became a tiger, and they both became these wild beings and discovered their innate feral nature. What actually is true form. I mean, at their heart, fairy tales is about so much about transformation. And I love what you're saying as well about what stories do we choose to tell, and which ones are not our stories to tell. They either don't mirror us, they don't speak to us, and that sense of, okay, this one I can share. Or you probably have experienced it every time you tell a story, Diana, that these come from an oral tradition, these stories. So they shifted a little bit depending on the audience. And every time you tell it, it's a little bit different. There might be sometimes when I've told the same story that I've told 100 times to a group, I'll suddenly say something, and the girl said this to the witch, the wolf, or whatever. And it's like, whoa, where did that come from? But there's a little girl in the audience who goes, yes, that's just what I'm going to say. Or, yes, that's what happened to me. There's that engagement that happens with the audience, which is one of the problems when fairy tales started becoming literary and written down. They became static. They became more formulaic and not adaptable. They kind of became a bit more 2D, but it also meant they spread further. But it meant that there's this idea that the Grimm's Brothers version of Red Riding Hood is the true original only version of Red Riding Hood, which is not true at all. So let's dive into a little bit more of the history of fairy tales and a few examples. Actually, I just want to have a little look at a bit about what fairy tales are about and some of the things that I feel they stand for. There's a lot about standing up to power and about social rising. The underdog makes good, or the silly one has all the wisdom. The kind one, there's so much about kindness and compassion in fairy tales. If you're not kind, you won't have jewels falling out of your mouth and you won't get the gold. Be kind to all the animals and they will reward you with their gifts. The arrogant ones have nasty things happen, like toads jump out of their mouth. So the kindness, learning how to be rebellious. I'm not going to do just what you said. I'm going to go off and do this, and there's trouble, but whoa, do I get a lot of support and a lot of amazing rewards. So they also teach us where and how to push the edges of things. About animal relationships, the archetypes I've mentioned, courage, finding courage and inner strength, and listening with nature, standing up to adversity, going, hell no, there's got to be another way than this. How might I actually find a way of doing this? And then the witch or whoever it is will say, well, if you want to get your husband back, if you want to get your brothers alive, if you want to be able to, whatever it is, you're going to need to climb the glass mountain or do these impossible tasks. It teaches us that impossible doesn't exist, that there's always a way around it, particularly if you allow the support from the land. From the animals. They bring in knowledge, they change the social order, or they can conform it as well. They can lay it down even more tightly. The power of persistence. Oh my goodness. One of the key things about the attributes of women as heroines in a lot of these fairy tales that's different from the hero tales is that they go inwards or they go down. They often go into the underworld and comb the hair of dragons with beautiful golden combs, or they go down through the well, or they go into the forest, or they lose their hands, they lose their tongue. They need to weave nettle shirts, collect nettles. I mean, the length of time that would take to weave nettles and make beautifully embroidered shirts for 11 brothers. So persistence. And for women, it's often about going in and then there's an epiphany. You spend 7 years in a forest and then your hands grow back through the power of love and of nature and some indefinable force that you can only find in a forest. Or you need to go and swim with the fish for a certain length of time and then wisdom will come. So there's often a retreat in some way. You need to go and hang out in a tower for 100 years or climb down from the tower with your amazing hair. So there's this going inwards and an epiphany. And then there's often a bit more hard work for the women as well, but they're usually doing it themselves. So what else? It's about opposites. And I guess the other thing is that they teach us about how to listen with the ears of the mythic, to listen between the worlds, to the voices and the languages that we don't usually hear. So they also give us warnings as well. So I'm going to pop on some slides. Let me share this. Oops, not that one. Share this one. Okay. I love this quote from Charles de Lint, and he says that people who've never read fairy tales, they don't cope as well in life than people who have read fairy tales because they don't have access to all of the lessons that can be learned from the journeys through dark woods and the kindness of strangers when you treat them decently. That they teach us about all those things that I was mentioning. And they teach us that you can have a really nasty stepmother or a dead father, live a really tough life, and through listening, through other things, through going out, through making an effort, something can come in that is utterly unbelievable, utterly unexpected, and there can be other ways. They teach us hope. They give us knowledge. I love this from Sarah and Brittany of the Carter Hall School. They teach us what's dangerous and what's safe. They teach us how to act and how to be rebellious women. They teach us the power of being monstrous, the power of Baba Yaga. I mean, I didn't want to be the nice little princess, I have to admit. I wanted to be Baba Yaga. I wanted to fly around the world in a cauldron. I wanted to have a house with chicken feet that danced around. I wanted that kind of power as a kid. I didn't care that she was ugly. I thought she was fabulous. They teach us how to push beyond limits. They teach women how to be curious. So many stories have reframed women's curiosity as lethal, as dangerous, as being bad for the whole world. But in the old versions of those stories, women's curiosity, women's intuition was revered and honored and led to incredible wisdom, led to great revelations. We've already done that. So the difference between folk tales and legends and myths. So a myth is basically something that is very universal. There's a sacred nature to it. There's a sacred narrative to it. It's set outside of any historical time. There's divine or semi-divine beings. They might be origin or creation myths, or explaining how the land was formed. So it comes to, they explain something. They show us the way something was shaped or formed, and they deliberately bring in the sacred. A legend is considered to be somewhere or somehow rooted in history. There's a time that it's connected to, like Homer's story of Odysseus and the Trojan Wars, the stories of Atlantis, the stories of monsters in Loch Ness. There's this, yeah, they're true, the stories of the Selkies. They're legends. We can place them in the land somewhere, and we can place them in time. There's a lot of Irish and Welsh and Scottish stories that are actually fairy tales, but they're rooted in place. Down from Killynabrogel, there was a woman named whoever who did this, and it was near the loch of so-and-so. So it's rooted in place, and this is the story of that place of the land. This is the story of that particular tree that you can go and visit today, that great mound at Killynabrogel. You can go there, and that's where Maeve, Queen Maeve of the fairies of the Shining Ones, rode through or was buried. So with I believe with the oral versions of the stories, they're rooted in place. They anchor us definitively into the landscape. When they started becoming literary, when they started being written down and printed, they lost their relationship to the land and they became more generalist. So there's this whole other exploration that you can do, is listening for the tales of the land where you live. Listen to what stories that stick might tell you, or that tree. And that roots us in an eco-mythological way into the landscape, roots us in and roots the land into us as well, and brings us into relationship. Defining a fairy tale is really, really, really difficult. They never used to be called fairy tales, and I'll get to how they came to be called that in a moment, because they never used to be about fairies as such. They were just folk tales. And folk tales are either divided up into fables, which are animal stories, like the Brer Rabbit stories, for instance, and Romulus and Remus. Let's see, or these other tales that involve supernatural or enchanted happenings and creatures that talk to you as well. So they're usually short. They're originally part of an oral tradition. They're divided into two. One is an oral form, and the other is the literary, the written down form. So the oral form, as I was saying, is usually rooted to place in some way. So in the last 200 years, they were thought to be written for children. They weren't. There's so many very, very adult themes. They're bawdy, they're erotic, they're outrageous. But so many hidden metaphors that a grown-up would go, oh yeah, in them. That's not who they were written for. However, like I think it was Diana was saying before, there's you can read it as a child and derive great pleasure from it, from the story. She got eaten by a wolf, and your parent jumps at you and goes, and the wolf grabs you, and they scream with laughter, and it's great fun. Children often love some of the really brutal bits in the fairy tales. I'm going to gobble you up. So they can be read on one level. It's like the Australian Indigenous or any Indigenous stories. There's different levels. You can read it on the superficial level. This, and this happened. Then there's all the hidden meanings of it. So they can be read as a parable for social beliefs and values. And they can also be then read as a metaphor for the way the stars are moving in the sky or the planets are moving. And there's all these layers and levels of meaning that you can then be initiated into in an Indigenous culture for those with the ears to hear and the eyes to see. Fairy tales are a lot like tarot cards in that they can have embedded codes in them and a way of carrying underground messages as well. So let's see. Fairy tales are also set in another world, another time. Once upon a time. It's a time without time. It's a place without place. Shaka and Jones's definition is they're an open-ended, playful way of engaging social and political issues in a form that is utterly beyond any level of realism, that defies the constraints of realist fiction rather than as a fixed discursive form that has a particular set of narrative rules. One of the things with fairy tales is that they're really matter of fact. They're very one-dimensional characters. There's no emotion in them. The stepmother hated the stepson so much that she put his head in the trunk and banged the lid down and knocked it off. Then she chopped him up and fed him to her daughter and her son for dinner. And the husband said, yum, that was delicious. There's no emotional responses, which can diffuse some of the horror of them a little bit. And the characters don't develop really in those shorter versions of the stories very much. Some of the greater literary versions extend that a whole lot more. So there's particular, this is the theme, these are the motifs, these are the tropes that develop. And there's no blinking at talking animals. A fox came along and said blah-de-blah. Oh, she said, will you help me? Back to the fox, as if every day you can have an easy communication with a fox. The witch did this and turned her into a snake. And then everybody just knows that she's the snake or the deer woman, that she's been transformed. So there's this whole, actually there's a lot of transformation in them as well. Okay, so let's see, folklore and a whole body of culture shared by a particular group of people. So there'll be folklore related to particular cultures. The thing is that these stories don't recognize borders anywhere. They just kind of cross backwards and forwards like they're butterflies. The key themes or images just literally cross the world. So fairy tales are a distinct genre within folklore. And they cross absolutely everywhere. Let me just go back and give you some examples. Okay, do you recognize this? Once upon a time, there's a beautiful courtesan whose name was Rhodopsis, and she was Greek, and her skin was the color of golden honey, and her hair was black and glossy as a Kalamata olive, and her eyes, oh my goodness, her brown eyes were the color of river pebbles that was sparkling in the water of a river in the springtime. She was beautiful. Now, one day, Rhodopsis was swimming and bathing in the river, and her little woven sandals were placed on a rock nearby in the sun, when all of a sudden, down from the sky came a great eagle, and he picked up one of her sandals in his claws, and he flew with the sandal and flew and flew and flew all the way from Greece across the Mediterranean, all the way to Egypt. And then the eagle flew into the great palace of the Egyptian pharaoh, and over the lap of the pharaoh, the eagle dropped the slipper. And the pharaoh thought this was really pretty extraordinary. An eagle has come all the way in here and then dropped this in my lap. It must mean something pretty darn big. And it's a beautiful sandal. It's dainty, it's elegant. And who belongs to it? Who owns this sandal? So he hunted everywhere that he could, and no one fitted the sandal, until somebody finally mentioned, well, there's this woman I've heard of, this courtesan called Rhodopsis, and he found her, and lo and behold, the shoe fit. So he invited her to marry him, and the courtesan married the pharaoh and became a great queen of the land. And that version of what became known as Cinderella was written in about 500 BC by Herodotus. And the stories of Cinderella go back, way back before that, thousands of years. Actually, one of the oldest fairy tales that they've managed to trace through the themes and through I guess they're looking at some of the language of it. They've traced it back 6,000 years. Others, like some of the versions of Animal Bridegrooms or other versions of Red Riding Hood or Cinderella, go back 3,000 or 4,000 years. There's Chinese versions of Cinderella where she doesn't have a fairy godmother there. She has a golden fish who gives her all of these fabulous frocks and these little golden shoes that are covered in golden fish scales. And they're tiny, and it relates into foot binding as well. This whole shoe, feet motif and these tiny little shoes, so that only the most elegant crippled woman could actually fit into them in China. There's versions of Cinderella in 1001 Nights in Scheherazade stories. There's a version in the 15th century Venetian Straparolas, in Giambattista Basile, in Charles Perrault, in the Grimms. The Grimms got rid of the fairy godmother and went back to an original oral version with the hazel tree and the little bird who made magic. Disney and the sugar coating of the Cinderella of the 1950s. And what it sort of ended up happening all the way along is that from about the late 1600s onwards, women got more and more passive in the stories, less and less sexual, more and more relying on heroes. More stepmothers came in because the Grimms had a belief that mothers could only be good and nice and loving. So in the early versions, they actually had mean mothers who would kill their children or send them off to starve in the forest. But the Grimms decided that that couldn't possibly be true because all mothers had to be nice. So they brought in evil stepmothers because so many mothers died in childbirth or for other reasons. So mean stepmothers came in, and they made fathers all good as well, was another thing that the Grimms did, and they changed things quite a bit. So for example, in the fairy tales, there's violence, there's incest, there's rape, the early ones are just full on. So what the Grimm brothers did is they had to make the fathers nice. So for example, the king was very, very sad at the fact that he had to burn his wife and kill her, or the father was very, very sad that he had to marry his daughter. So they tried to make the fathers all good in a way to uphold a fine German nationalistic tradition that was suitable. So I'll get on to them and their scheming, lying ways in a moment. Versions of Cinderella in Thailand, Iraq, Greece, just all around the world. And they modified all these stories depending on their audience or what they wanted to represent. The beauty of tiny crippled feet in China, for instance, or I don't know quite what the value of golden fish might be in China, but there's probably some symbol that relates to that. very, very briefly, in fairy tales, there's key motifs or dominant themes that go through. Um, the woman who marries the handsome prince that marries a beautiful princess who was a beggar girl, talking animals, social social upliftment, magical helpers. The youngest child is smarter than the oldest one. The beautiful sister, the ugly sister. Repetitive phrases, tick tack tock. Tim did whatever it is. These little rhymes, impossible tasks, climbing the glass mountain, sorting the lentils from the poppy seeds. So there's key themes or motifs. And the other thing is a trope. So when anthropologists and folklorists started collecting all of these folklore from around the world, they realized that there were just stacks of variants. There's about 700 versions of Cinderella. There's about 1,000 versions of Red Riding Hood around the world. There's hundreds of varieties across Africa, through to Europe, through to Australia. It was actually an Australian who wrote Jack and the Beanstalk. So a trope, what it is, in the A2 classification system, which is based on 3 men, Auntie Anne, Stith Thompson, and Uther, can't remember his other name. What they did was they came up with a whole series of what they called tropes. The rescue by the sister is trope number 311. Let's see, animal bridegrooms is a particular ATU number. Animal bridegrooms fox is another number. Animal bridegrooms bear is another one, and that might then have Valaman attached to it, or east of the sun, west of the moon. Lost husband will be another trope. So they're all listed. So there's just hundreds and hundreds of tropes that you can look up. I want to look up a theme of princess locked in tower, and then you'll have a list of, say, 100 different fairy tales. So it's a way of trying to classify them. We've had a little bit of a chat about their key characteristics, in that they're short, they're pretty flat, there's no emotion, there's magic. It's really clear who's good and who's evil. There's really simple linear plots, this, then this, then this, then this. There's recurring patterns. Things happen in threes, 3 sisters, 3 brothers. Maybe there's 12 brothers. There's 7 things, 3 wishes. So there's sort of these repetitions of particular numbers. And the other key thing is that there's no one author. These tales have been rolled over through the throats of so many tellers, thousands upon thousands of tellers for thousands of years, that they're kind of, actually they're rubbed as smooth as river rocks, and they're honed as well. There's a depth, and they have their own field. I'll just mention, like, Rupert Sheldrake back in the late 80s talked about morphogenetic fields, which is, for example, initially no one could ever run. It's at the 3-minute mile, and then suddenly one person could run, then everybody could run, well, except for me, could run a 3-minute mile. There's a field of this becomes possible. There's a field of knowing, or an energy or a pattern of this has been done, so therefore it is available in the world. It makes it easier for others. Heart surgery was impossible, and now people will have 3 or 4 heart surgeries if they need it, and it's fine, and they're back home again 3 days later. So it can help things become easier. There's, like, you can slot into that pattern. The same thing with fairy tales, is that you can, sometimes people almost get caught in a tale where it's almost like they're acting it out. And Jung has a lot to say about that as well, and how we can get caught in an archetype. The only cure for that is to read more fairy tales, so that you are hit with more and more and more archetypes, so that you don't get trapped within one. Actually, a really, really curious anomaly that I've heard from a few special ed teachers is that children with ADD, ADHD, or who are on the autism spectrum scale somewhere, they might have a bit of trouble speaking, or reading generally, but when they read fairy tales, they can read them with greater ease. There's something in the structure of a fairy tale, just reading Grimm's original old fairy tales, they can read them more easily. Which I found really, really fascinating. Okay, I'll skip this. This is a Russian guy, Vladimir Prop. What he decided, based on Russian fairy tales, is that there's only 31 different ranges of action and the way the story can progress in all fairy tales. There's a departure, and then there's a trickery, or there's a violation, then there's or a deception, then there's a good guy that comes in and helps them, a magical agent, or the hero acquires a magical tool. So he's got this whole list. Maybe this really applies to Russian stories. It doesn't necessarily apply to all the others, particularly not the rewriting of ones these days, which is very exciting what's happening. Curiously, though, one of the things with the old oral stories through Eastern Europe is they've stayed a lot more radical than the sanitized, infantilized versions in the West. So in the West, they got rid of the women who were strong and stroppy, made them passive and silly, often, or relying on a hero. Or they brought a hero in to rescue the woman. In the original, she never needed that. Whereas in, say, the Macedonian fairy tales, you've got cross-dressing women who are soldiers, who are the ones who rescue really silly princes and got to bring them up to scale in order to marry them. You've got these women of strength. You've got horses that do extraordinary things that women then ride. And there's these interesting ways of gender fluidity and of power and transformational fluidity that you can still read today. Actually, probably from, say, Italy further east. So let's have a look at, actually just have a breath. This is a fair bit of stuff here. Have a stretch. Literary versus oral folk tales. So they were not written down. They were told by mouth. The audience responded, the teller responded. They were given according to what was appropriate at the time to that audience. Then they started being written down. So some of the earliest ones where they then became written down is Alf Layla wa Layla, the Arabian Nights, or 1001 Nights, which is work that has actually been drawn from India, from Sanskrit, from Persia, from around that whole Syria, Egyptian area. Did I say India? A lot actually came up from India. So in this story, basically Scheherazade tells truth to power, and she convinces this revolting sheikh, Shahzan, teaches him how to be able to love a woman and to be appreciative and respectful instead of killing them all. So those stories gradually began to be written down anytime from about the 6th, 7th, 8th century onwards, and then compiled a bit more around the 10th century. So the oral stories in the West before that, if you think of the spinsters, who were the spinning women around the weaving rooms, and the amount of darn weaving and spinning and spindling that you actually had to do in order to make enough cloth. I mean, these women always had a spindle at their hip, so if they were walking down to get the water, they could be twiddling thread, always twiddling thread, which made me really cranky actually in Sleeping Beauty, where the king decides to ban all spindles and all spinning wheels from the entire kingdom in order to try and save his daughter. I mean, that would just be, I mean, how could you ban having any cloth? You'd have to import it from everywhere, and banning all of women's work. I just found that a really bizarre motif in that story. So there's the Arabian Nights. Straparola, he wrote the Facetious Nights, or the Pleasant Nights, and so this was in the West, was one of the first known books of folk tales, where he gathered folk tales around Venice and around northern Italy and wrote them down. couple had fairies in them, but most of them actually didn't. His name is actually a bit of a pun as well, that comes from meaning talks too much. Giovanni the Gossip, it sort of relates to. None of the stories were original. He just gathered them, re-edited them, put in a few bourgeois kind of beliefs, and also one of the other things in the early 1500s around Venice is there was a big depression. So people were getting really broke. So there was all these stories that he put in about sudden wealth and of being able to rise to a different social class, enough food and enough lodging, how to get rich fast, a lot of his stories. So again, the culture that you're living in, the society that you're in. And in Italy at the time, you couldn't have a socially unequal marriage. It was illegal. The peasant girl could not marry the baron. The only way that you could rise to another class was through magic. Okay. Jean-Baptiste Basile, he was a Neapolitan guy. So he was collecting, he wrote a book, Il Conti della Conto della Conti, so the tale of tales. And he collected a lot of stories from around everywhere from Sicily and the southern parts of Italy, and he put them in dialect, which made it really radical. He didn't put it in posh Latin. He wrote it in the language of the people, and he was the one who had some of the earliest original versions of Rapunzel that were written down, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, for instance. Though he borrowed from a lot of oral tales, he borrowed a bit from Straparola, and so he was writing in the early 1600s. Now, some of my favorites. So what we had from Straparola and Giambattista Basile were sort of these oral folk tales that had been put down into words and poshed up a little bit. So they were still pretty simple, the stories, and short. So if we go into France in the late 1600s, Louis XIV had been on the throne for a while. We had an absolutist monarchy. We had the whole court, the politics, everything was very much kept at Versailles and at Paris, and not out in the countryside. He'd subdued a lot of the really big landholders around Aquitaine and Toulouse. They were pretty crushed down south by then. So it was very power was concentrated. There was a lot of piety. Women had no power whatsoever, could not own any property, could not get a divorce, and sex was a husband's absolute legal right. Marriages were often arranged in the aristocracy. So I'm talking about more of the aristocratic classes, for financial reasons or to bring power into particular families. So you had a lot of young girls being married to these often older men. And no choice. If you rebelled, then you're either sent to a convent or sent to a madhouse. So there was to have a lot of love affairs, like Charlotte Rose de la Force, who was this wild woman in the late 1600s who ended up being shut up in a convent because she was having too many love affairs. There's this one gorgeous story about her where she was trying to get to her lover, but she wasn't allowed to be seen. So she dressed up as a dancing bear and danced and sort of sung her way into his bedroom so she could have a wild night with him, and then snuck out again in the morning, except she was caught a few too many times. She wrote erotic, witty novels. She was scandalous. She was this rebellious, gorgeous, free spirit. There was this group of women in Paris who set up these witty salons. Now, one of the only ways that you could critique Louis XIV without ending up in the Bastille or being sent to a country estate or a convent, was to kind of couch it in riddles or in metaphoric terms. So these women who were incredibly erudite, intellectuals who were running and participating in these salons, where words of wit were the de rigueur of the day, they started writing these stories. There was a whole group of them. There's about 6 of them, of aristocratic, well-educated women who wrote these fairy tales. And this was where the word fairy tale actually came in, from Baroness d'Aulnay, who wrote the book Les Contes de Fées, The Tale of the Fairies, which then got translated into English as fairy stories, fairy tales. And she wrote, or actually all of them wrote stories about warning women of the dangers of arranged marriages. They wrote versions of Red Riding Hood that warned about how wolves don't always have a long tail, that men can have wolves living on the inside of their being. They wrote love stories where women found love and women chose love. So they're kind of like following on in that tradition from the 1300s of the troubadours, and writing stories that were empowering for women. They were proto-feminists, they were glorious, and they lived bloody tough lives, some of them. Baroness d'Aulnay she was married at something like 14, pregnant, in domestic violence relationships. She escaped, she became a spy. She was caught escaping from windows doing spycraft for the state. She wrote these stories. She ran salons. She got rid of her stinking husband. They were as radical as they could be, and they could get away with what they were saying by couching it. Oh, it's just a story about fairies. But they were very, very naughty fairies, according to the law of the land at the time. So they were coding in these social rebelliousness, their versions of morals and ethical conflicts. Also at the same time was, I'm going to have to mention him, I'd rather not. Oh, here's gorgeous Madame d'Aulnay, who coined the word fairy tale. Charles Perrault, Patooey. So Charles Perrault, he was actually the uncle of one of these fabulous salonières or conteurs women, Madame L'Heritier. And he wrote his book called Mother Goose Tales in 1697. He basically plagiarized Jean-Baptiste Bazille, and he sort of altered the stories. He made them very, very heavy with, this is how women should behave. He wrote this disgusting version of Bluebeard where he was blaming the woman's death on her because she was curious. Because she found out that her husband was essentially a repugnantly revolting serial killer, he said, well, if women weren't curious, it would be fine and you won't end up killed. I mean, really. His whole version of Red Riding Hood was, if you are morally reprehensible and follow the path of needles, which is the path of being sexually active, then you're going to get eaten by a wolf. He was an advocate of arranged marriages. He just had these just very, very heavy on the moralizing. I'll just skip over him and come along to the Grimm brothers. Now there's just to actually mention what they did with Charles Perrault and why no one has heard as much of these extraordinary French conteuses as we should have, and why people have heard of Charles Perrault and his stinking versions of Red Riding Hood and Cinderella, is because the Grimm brothers, when they were doing their research into folklore and gathering all of their oral stories, they looked at Charles Perrault. They thought that the witty, erudite, subtle, laden with symbol stories of they were pretty long stories, I have to admit, the fairy tales of the French women, they decided they were way too literary, they weren't written by the people, and they didn't have the values that they aspired to. So what they did is they said they were women anyway. Basically, it was sexism. So they just dismissed all of those glorious women and picked up Charles Perrault as a fine, upstanding man, and promoted his stories to the hilt, which is why people have heard of him. So basically those conteuses were just a way for women to have a voice in the politics of the day and to say things that they couldn't say otherwise, and couch them in these beautiful riddles and stories. So the French women had all of these nuances and depth, and Charles Perrault didn't at all. So he just basically took the fairy tales, tacked a whole pile of morals to them, and his morals are very, very questionable, I have to say. So Grimm brothers So let's see what they were doing. So when they were born was really interesting. They were born at the time just before the French Revolution, before the Napoleonic Wars. So when they were growing up, and let's see, they were reasonably well educated. Their father died pretty young. So they had this incredible view of fathers as being this wonderful being that every family should have one. Because they were father deprived, and there was quite a lot of kids. So instantly overnight, they lost their money, and they had to try and find these benefactors in order to be able to support them having a good middle class education. So around that time, when they were studying in their early 20s, was the time of the Napoleonic Wars, and Napoleon had spread out from France and was taking over as much of the Prussian Empire. There was no Germany at that time. There was hundreds and hundreds of little states. There was that whole Prusso-Hungarian Empire, and one of the things that Napoleon did when he occupied that area was that, I think I've got some pictures of this. Yeah, he created what became known as the Confederation of the Rhine. Took over lots of Italy as well, and he brought about 31 states. So what started happening when this sort of German state was in its infancy is that they were occupied by the French. We don't want that. So there was this movement of romantic idealism of what is the German state, what is true Germanism. And the Grimm brothers were right in there looking at with nationalistic fervor at their language, because they felt that the language was essential to discovering the true nature of what the German people or the German Volk, the German peasantry was about, and that you could find the true essence of Germanness by discovering what the peasants talked about. I mean, apart from the fact that most of the peasants were poverty struck, generational poverty struck, were illiterate and had hardly any food and were desperate to just try and make enough to try and survive on, let alone try and survive the Napoleonic Wars. But anyway, there was this Rousseau-esque, the power is in the people, as long as we don't have to relate to them too much, coming from the bourgeois background or of the aristocracy. We're just going to admire them from our heights here, because they are the ones who hold the true essence of Germanness. So we're going to romanticize and idealize them, not give them any more rights and not give them any more food and make sure they can't vote. But that's beside the point. We'll still believe that they create the essence of what we would like to describe as Germanness. One of the things that happened for them when they were researching, and they were being trained as linguists and as lawyers at the Marburg University in Hanau, and they started exploring through a lot of medieval manuscripts, and then came across a lot of the old myths and legends, the German the myths and legends, stories of the Valkyries, of Brunhilde. So this mythic past that they felt was essentially German, and that they could claim this sense of who we are, and to help establish our nationalist identity, and particularly after the Napoleonic Wars, to try and create stability and unity to this idea of a German state. So they, what they did was that they started gathering stories, and I've got this quote from one of my, I think it's from about the 1920s, one of my Grimm brothers books, and it says in the foreword that where they were born, when they died, they were educated at Marburg University, and they were on the staff of Göttingen University and later moved to Berlin. As quite young men, the brothers began a life's work of research into the folklore of the country, listening to and writing down legends and stories as they heard them in the cottages of the peasants in villages and in the country places. Then they discovered material in the medieval manuscripts preserved in libraries and museums, and keeping strictly to the originals, they made their world famous collections of fairy and folk tales. Hogwash. They didn't at all. They had an agenda. They were being paid for by their benefactors, and there was this whole aim, political aim, which was absolutely fine. I understand the rise of nationalism. I understand the idea of unification of Germany, but what I don't get is why they said, we went to the country people, and on the frontispiece of their early book, they've got a picture here of beautiful peasant Gamma Gretel. And Gamma Gretel gave them a lot of stories. So in their 1812 edition of Kinder- und Hausmärchen, so children's and house tales book. Gamma Gretel turned out to be Dorothea Weitmann, and Dorothea Weitmann was the wife of a very middle-class tailor and she was quite well educated. So she wasn't quite this poverty-struck, sweet little old lady after all. A lot of their tales were gathered from wherever they could reach them, from their friends and from their family, from nursemaids, from governesses, and also because of the French Protestants, the Huguenots, had to flee France. They were kicked out of France, so they flooded into the Protestant areas of the Germanic lowlands. So they gathered them from a lot of French Protestants, from French Huguenots. So a lot of what they actually gathered was French. Everybody knew that Sleeping Beauty was a French story, but they kind of came up with reasons why it was truly German. Brunhilde, in one of the early myths, she fell into an enchanted sleep. So therefore, Sleeping Beauty is essentially German. So they kind of stretched things in many ways. What they did originally was, when they were collecting all the stories, they realized that there were variations from all around the world. One of the things that was interesting that they did was that they collated the versions, simplified them all down, and picked the version that they thought was best, and then put it in their book. So originally they collected 85 stories, synthesized them, put them into Low German instead of High German to make it sound like they were even more peasant-based and true of the Volk, Germanic Volk stories, and which upset a lot of the bourgeoisie. This is in Low German. How could we read this plebeian German to our children? At that time as well, there was this real rise of the bourgeoisie, and there was also starting to be a change in this idea of what children actually were instead of mini adults, and this appreciation for childhood, creating toys, creating books specifically for children. One of the things that Grimm's noticed in an early stage of marketing, actually one of the earliest great marketing adventures, was that people, particularly bourgeois people, were saying, we're reading these stories to the children and the kids really like them, but they don't have enough Christian ideology in them, and they've got a lot of sort of nasty stuff in them. So what the Grimms did was, in their next versions, they had about 7 versions all the way along from 1812 up to 1857. They got rid of all of the sex. Rapunzel was no longer pregnant, and the witch didn't notice that her belly was sticking out. And they got rid of all of the bad mothers, and they made all mothers all good, all fathers all good, except for the ones that had to kill their wives, but that's beside the point. And they made stepmothers evil, and then they also, curiously enough, really curiously, they upped the violence. So they made them moralistic, but made them increasingly, like, they brought in stuff like Cinderella's stepsisters, when they were found out to have cheated the prince, they had their eyes plucked out by doves. I mean, really, that's just like some weird gothic fantasy novel. So they added in other stuff as well. So it kind of weird. But what increasingly happened is that they discovered that they cornered the Christmas market for children, giving children Christmas presents, and they started making big money. So they altered the book. They added in more stories. They simplified them even more. They made them even more moralistic. Kept a fair bit of the violence, and just made loads and loads of money. They got translated into English. They got translated into many other languages around the world. And promoting this idea of the wise, uncorrupted, uncorruptible peasant, this sort of primitive quintessence of this romantic idealism. The closer you get to the land, the closer they got to discovering an authentic Germanic past. And what happened in German as well is that the Volk meant the common people, and the Volk also means the nation. So those two kind of got really entwined together. So this whole idea that these fairy tales were from the people, which is also why the French conteuses and the troubadour stories all just got pushed into the past, because they couldn't be true, and nationalism was sprouting its wings all around the world. So this dream of national unity and independence relied on full knowledge of the cultural past that was reflected in the folklore. So suddenly there was a rush of people collecting these folk stories everywhere, through Germany, through Italy, through France, through England, to capture their unique essence, and how oral folklore ties into ancient mythology. So one of the, coming on from them, actually, I'll go in chronological order here, and then I'll mention what Hitler did to folk stories, and this amazing propaganda that he brought in. So what we have up in Norway is we have Asbjørnsen and Moe. They had their own fairy tales, because there's glorious tales up there. They also had a nationalistic aim. What is Norway? It comes down to the country simple folk. So they wrote in this rustic kind of style and had this gorgeous cover for their book. So some of their stories that became really famous is the revision of Cupid and Psyche myth, of east of the sun, west of the moon, or Valamon, why the sea is salt. They did the Three Billy Goats Gruff, and the trolls under the bridge there, because trolls and ogres are pretty big in Norway. And one of my favorite stories, there's so many fairy tales where you have the ugly sister and the beautiful sister, and the ugly sister is mean and the beautiful sister is lovely and kind, and she gets the goods. What I love about Tatterhood or Tattercloak is that there's two sisters, the woolly wild rough one who rides a goat and who bangs a spoon everywhere, and the beautiful one, and they are the best of buddies, and they support and love each other. And the beautiful one gets the chance of the prince, and she goes, heck no, I don't want the prince. I want to go off in a boat with my beloved sister, and let's tour the world, get a bit of education, save all sorts of people from all sorts of things, because my amazing sister here with the goat and the spoon has all sorts of magic, and God, she's gorgeous. And then once they've done that for a while, they decide to settle down, and the goat woman is still teaching the prince all sorts of things. It's just beautiful story. Of sisters who love each other, not being competitive. Oh, Hans Christian Andersen, poverty-struck, illiterate family, taught himself to read, got some education, and had an extraordinary life of frequent unrequited love. He was probably pretty gay. He was in love with various men unrequited. He fell in love with Jenny Lind, the singer, utterly unrequited. And he wrote these stories that were heartbreakingly sad. Some were really based on folk tales. There's virtue, there's resilience, there's perseverance. The story of the little match girl is just heartbreaking. Oh, the nightingale piercing its heart on the rose for love. Hardly any of them have a good ending. Maybe the Snow Queen does, when the glass falls out of the heart. But he became so well renowned. But he always had this, I'm from a poor family, and that sort of a working class, almost like a shame. And when he was dealing with the upper classes, those upper echelons, as his books became more and more famous. So he said just people will have a bit of a hard life, then they're going to die, and terrible things can happen to really good people. It's sort of the pattern that a lot of his stories kind of tend to follow. It's rare that he actually gave anyone happy endings, and he often threw in a lot of Christian moralizing as well. So at the end of like The Little Mermaid, the prince never gets around to loving her. She loses her voice. She never really gets back to her family, and then she becomes sea foam at the end. And there's this whole idea, because she loves so deeply, she can actually gain a soul, because mermaids can't ever have soul because they're kind of animals, and sort of this Christian symbolism that comes into his story view. So just very, very sad. A lot of people really jump to conclusions about his life and his experiences, and talk about that a lot more than his stories. But he always seemed to feel kind of inadequate as well. Let's see, who else? Where are we at? When did we start? I started at 9:30. Okay, got half an hour. I'll just wind up and then we'll do something. Oscar Wilde. Both of his parents were actually folklorists, and as well as his stunningly witty, glorious plays and books that he wrote, he also wrote a whole bunch of just glorious fairy tales. The Happy Prince, The Selfish Giant, that one of the Nightingale of the Rose. And he celebrated love. He celebrated kindness and compassion and generosity, and he brought in the awareness of the body, and he was just sensitive, lovely, lovely stories. And it's just a crime what happened to him. Let's see, and I'll just mention, just a very, very quick mention of Lafcadio Hearn. He was Irish and Greek, and he fell in love with and married a Japanese woman, a gorgeous, sensitive, incredible man. And he just dived into Japanese culture, and he wrote all these, through his wife, he learned Japanese as well. And he gathered all of these incredible folk tales. And you can, if you read any of Lafcadio Hearn's folktale books, there's a lot of the Japanese ghost stories. They had a lot of really wild ghost stories over there, and a lot of the folk tales, and they're just these really beautiful stories, and really interesting ones as well that he came up with. We cannot mention folk stories without mentioning Disney. So when Disney first started doing a lot of his early stories and putting them into film. So for example, Snow White, which is actually apparently one of the highest grossing films of all time, relative to its time. It was the time of the Depression, and there was this absolute propaganda that he built into it of like, hi ho, we're really happy to work, and we've got jobs, and we've got food. And it was sort of like lolly food for the masses of joy and songs and cute little animals, appalling race and gender politics. He brought in the idea of the happy ever after, of luck, that if you work hard, and it actually, a lot of that symbolism really got entrenched in North America as well, and that whole coming in from the gold rush time through the 1800s, and that the West is just this golden land of milk and honey, and that if you work hard, you'll all make good. I mean, that's just pure Disney just overlapped with that as well. So I'm not surprised at how popular Disney became in the States, also. So and slightly shifting and changing themes as well once complaints started coming on in. So we now in Disney actually have heroines that are African American heroines, and different colored skins, and girls that are not as passive, but there's still often a happy ever after, even if you have to work a bit more for it. I loved in Maleficent, where true love's kiss was Maleficent was the one who loved it, because the prince couldn't, because he didn't really know her. I loved that as a change. But still, in that, the fairy princess, not fairy princess, the girl in Maleficent was this golden blonde, sort of sweet as pie kind of. There's no complexity, no grit to her no grit to her at all. So starting to bring in some of those changes, starting to pull itself out of sickly sentimentality, but it's also it brought fairy tales into the realm of large corporations, massive marketing, even more marketing than the Grimm brothers, even more marketing than Hitler did. And coming back to Hitler's fabulous propaganda, Hitler, with the rise of neo-fascism in Germany before World War II started, Hitler said that every household, if you are a proper German household, you had to have a copy of the Bible and a copy of Grimm's fairy tales, because Grimm's fairy tales hold true values of what being German actually means. And as a result of that, and of Hitler promoting Grimm's fairy tales so much, that during World War II and after World War II, because of the propaganda of it related to the German Reich, England banned Grimm's books for many, many years because it was associated with Nazism. So they were on the censored list for a long time, and then gradually brought back in. So I mean, I guess it's sort of a little bit of debate. Kids are still really loving some of the Disney fairy tales. I think one of the things that has really come in that I'd like to throw out into our cauldron is that change from oral tradition and the storyteller meeting the audience and offering something that flows through the storyteller into the world and is also altered by the audience. So something that is balanced carefully, skillfully with who is present and the land that is there as well. To then they became really static and written down. And so you're reading this two-dimensional version that is separated from the land. But it still has magic and enchantment, and it still has the imagination because you create the image in your own mind. And then we have the filmification of stories, which really cuts down the imagination. And one of the things that I hear a lot from primary school teachers is that when they ask kids to tell a story, what happened to you over the holidays? Tell me the story of what happened last night. Tell me your favorite story. And they'll describe a film, or they'll say what happened last night, and it'll be the story of Frozen or I don't know, whatever the latest little turtles are doing in their, whatever that turtle show is for kids. They're not actually able to create their own story. Tell me a story about a tree, and they'll recite something that they watched on television or on their iPads. So that degrading of the imaginal realm through film and the way that through listening or even reading that you can actually bridge into the mythic realm that then sparks your imagination rather than just repeating verbatim a story, a particular story. So I've sort of been chatting all the way along about why I think they're relevant and so potent. And how they're still used in so many ads here today. Yeah, I got a quote from Sharon Blackie that the fairy tales are stories which offer us a more enriching set of values to live by. Not always, particularly if you read Charles Perrault's stories, they're moralizing, simplistic, passive women. But anyway, the old versions give us a rich set of values. They show us that the greatest treasure of all is a kind heart. The most powerful magic always is made from an act of love, and that like the mother that has saved her children in various stories like the juniper tree or Cinderella, the dead mother, her love saves them, that no life-saving or world-changing goal can ever be achieved without the help of a community of others, and particularly the other than human realm. Oh, and I've got I'll get Fiona from the school to send off some resources and that too, if you'd like. That's sort of this wild hodgepodge of a bit of a history of of the fairy tales. I'm wondering, is there any other thoughts or questions or things that comes up for you, sort of listening to that wild ride, just to have a little bit of a touch base if you'd like to. Oh yeah, Aesop's tales as well, part of those fables and animal lore tales. You can get away with a hell of a lot of digging away at your government or the powers that be if it's couched in terms of animals doing things or fairies doing things. You can be as subversive as you like. Yeah. Yeah. Anything that you'd like to mention? Yeah.
Oh,
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 sorry, Joan. Yeah.
So I'm really interested in this idea that there are like 700 versions of Cinderella. And I would love to read some of them, especially the Chinese one. That sort of interests me.
Yeah.
Is it hard or easy to find some of those versions?
Yeah, these days it's really, really pretty easy. So for example, if you can just type it in and Wikipedia will have a list of a few. And what I do is I just collect as many fairy tale books as I can from secondhand bookstores all over the place. And read what I can, but they're only in English. So if you go to the, let me put it in here, Sur La Lune website, they have a huge number of a variety of fairy tales.
Oh,
If the, what is it, the Gutenberg Press website, that's got all the out of print books. So if you, in their search engine, if you put fairy tales, folklore, you'll come up with, like, I've got some great translated into English, all the Sumerian tales, the Babylonian tales of Gilgamesh, the Macedonian tales. Some of those are radical. I got all those cross-dressing women from those ones. So you can get a pile from the Gutenberg Press. The other gorgeous woman who I adore is Terry Windling, and her blog site is called Myth and More. And she will find a whole lot of research. I'll do a whole lot of research, find a whole lot of links, and then she'll just post that in a gloriously written blog. So you can cruise for weeks through her blogs. She's quite a delight. So there's a pile there. Let me just go. I will just copy. Can I do this? No, I'm just trying to go back to my, I'll send that slide and a link to you via Fiona, and she can post that out to everyone, just a whole bunch of them. There's, and it depends, these days you can explore via a feminist perspective, a Jungian perspective, a straight folklorist. So there's so much out there on the net that's accessible these days. And the other thing that I really, really recommend is just sitting with them and dreaming to see what they are in the intersection of the mythic realm, the story, and your psyche of where they go, because it might be the 701st variation that comes forth through your being and your body and how the story interacts with you. So there's so many rewritings of the stories these days, which are rich and evocative and is so much more than entertainment. It's about calling us into the wisdom of the forest, the wisdom, anchoring us in the wisdom of the earth, and touching that. I was talking about that longing that we have, or that remembering that we have of knowing that enchantment is true, that the other world is right there, that we get so much through a lot of the Celtic stories. Yeah. So what I was thinking of doing is just dropping you into a meditation space and seeing what comes up for you. And then you can have a bit of a write or a draw with that, and to take you into the mythic realm. And and see what arises when you engage with them, because I find in the group field, it just makes it exponential. It just makes it really more dynamic than when you do it yourself. So no, I won't tell you anything about it. I'll just lead you in bit by bit and see where you go. And you don't have to follow my words. You could have your own rebellious way of exploring. So if you start with the breath, and if you start with, because fairy tales are so much about the earth and nature, and if you, as you breathe in, what you're doing is you're breathing in the breath of trees. You're breathing in the breath of the forest, the ancient primeval forest, the forest of the tales of the stories, the forest that holds wonders. So let your breath draw in the energy of the trees into your beautiful body. And when you breathe out, you are breathing your presence, the mandala of your being, into the world and into the forest, or into the desert or the sea. So breathe and be breathed for the moment. And let this breath, this dance of breaths, bring you into your body, bring you into your belly, and dropping you in a little deeper. So you can feel yourself settling. You can feel that a balance right down there in the warmth of your belly. And be aware of the earth under your feet and the way the earth holds you and supports you. And feel held by the earth, by the land that you live on, by the trees and the mountains and the air. And by the heavens, by the cosmos washing over you like a shower of nectar washing over your beautiful being. And coming into your heart, feeling supported above and below, coming into your heart space. Your holy of holies, this is your inner sanctuary. And in your heart, there's that light that never, ever goes out. Your place. And here in your heart sanctuary, just get a sense of which fairy tale or which kind of character really resonates with you today in this moment. Is it a particular story? Is it a particular character? Maybe it's the 13th fairy, or the wolf, or the seal. And you might never have actually even related to them before, or this story. It might be someone that's just come in now. And if it's a whole story, then is there a character that you feel drawn to? Or maybe a character that feels drawn to you. It's not always from our point of view. Can you allow yourself to be touched by the story, to be noticed by it? To let it find you? It's never just a one-way thing with fairy tales. They interact with us. And here in your heart of hearts, Imagine that you're looking out the back door of your heart into the universe, because, beloveds, you have a universe just as big inside you as it is huge outside. We have the universe within us that connects straight to source, that connects to the other world, to all realms. So out through your heart, feeling safe and supported and protected, imagine moving between the worlds through time and space, and moving across the veil, across the threshold into the mythic realm, and arriving in the mythic realm of this story, or the realm of that character. And getting a sense of what that mythic realm might be like. And you might not see it, you might just have a knowing or a feeling or a sense. It might not look anything like what the story was about. But what is the realm like of that story or that character? And just check it out for a little while. Explore it. And in this realm, a character will come towards you, will find you. And this character has medicine, has wisdom, has something to show you, something perhaps for you to know or understand. And be guided by this character to where they might like to take you, or maybe they speak, maybe they don't. It's somewhere that they will take you and show you. And what is it that they reveal? What is it that they might show you about yourself or about themselves? And I'll leave you to explore and to connect. Is there anything else they might like to reveal about themselves? Is there anything that you might like to reveal about yourself to them? How do they touch you? If your story, maybe a recent story or your life story, was put into the mythic realm, how would this character fit in there? So just notice if there's any other characters that might like to come forth. And here in the mythic realm, with all of that imagination and creativity right there, if you were to rewrite that story, that fairy tale that the character's from, whose perspective would you write it from, or what would happen? How would the story change if you, here in the mythic realm, were to rewrite it? Winding up shortly, you'll be able to continue to write this or to commune with that character. But just for now, thanking them and thanking the mythic realm and knowing that you can visit at any time. And thanking it and then moving out from the mythic realm through the veil and back through time and space, back across the dimensions, back into the earth realm here and into through the back door of your heart. And just coming back into the sanctuary of your heart and feeling your whole body. When you're ready, just moving your fingers or your toes, and that's why you're still in a very still space. Whenever you're ready, just jotting anything down. Maybe it's a little drawing. Sometimes when we write, other words come out. Sometimes the characters keep speaking. Just another minute. Okay. Find that it just keeps flowing and moving for you as well. That there might be more messages, or I find once you just start talking to a character, they tend to butt into your life in all sorts of ways. So, or your dreams as well. It's a great way to commune through your dreaming body. If any thoughts or questions or ideas or stories arise in any way, please feel free to contact me. I've just popped my my email and Facebook and Instagram site there so you can track me. My website was eaten by a virus, so I'm procrastinating about getting it rebuilt at the moment. So it won't be up before the end of the year. And I spelt Terry Windling's name incorrectly, so I've just popped those up there as well. So yeah, feel free to touch base with me anytime. I really love hearing what comes up for folks. But I'd love to, if there's anything that you'd like to share about what came up for you with connecting with or having a character connect with you, anything that you'd feel comfortable mentioning, I'd love to have a hear if you'd like to share anything. Yeah, Diana.
Yes. I had a vision when I was, my husband had died suddenly, and in 1991, and in August. And I wrote, after that, I wrote, I had a vision, and literally the spirit said, take, quote unquote, take this down. I didn't write all of it. I wrote little pieces of it, but it was indelibly impressed on my psyche. So your voice is so hypnotic to me that I kind of drifted away. And then, but I came back when you were talking about like characters coming to you. So what came up was, first was some of my favorite stories, but then what came up was the Star Kachina, is what I call it, Legend of the Star Kachina. And so what came up is that she in the original vision, there were animals, but they weren't necessarily my animal. They were all the animals of the earth. And so what came up was that how she got around the universe and to visit was on a beautiful shining white mare, who happens to be one of my spirit helpers. So that came up, and then this is like added to the original vision. She began to visit the heroine Inashiana in her dreams and speak to her, to telling her stories to tell the children, and she became the village storyteller. And she would the how it came up was, she came to Inashiana in her dreams at night to tell her stories through the voice of a hawk, a wolf, a seal, and she always came with her white mare. And she told stories of like initiation stories to the children of the village, of the realm of the magic of storytelling, and how they could retell their lives.
That sounds like a remarkably complex and beautiful vision that you received. I'm just for time reasons, we're just going to need to wind up really shortly, but I'd love to hear more of that. That's just sounds like, I love the image of moving through the skies on a great white mirror, and the stories to be able to share with all the children. You've left the group with this richness of symbols. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Just have
Thank you for listening.
Oh, pleasure. Thank you for that. Joan and Zoe, is there anything that you'd like to mention or share?
It was a lovely meditation. I didn't connect with a particular character, but I was definitely in the forest with magic and all the magical creatures. And I just felt really at home there and accepted as one of them, so that I could go in there and I could take part in the magic myself. So that was nice.
Oh, yes. To be one of the magic ones. Yes. Thank you. Anything you want to mention, Zoe, or you don't have to, just if you did?
Yeah, no, just that I found it really beautiful to do. And similarly, I just sort of had this experience of just kind of traveling through, you know, like all of the different, you know, magical worlds that I've sort of touched on. You know, when you were sort of talking about going through the back of the heart, like it really, I, you know, found myself almost going through like the back of the wardrobe, which was so lovely and, you know, familiar. So, yeah, thank you.
Yes, all these roots that we can have. The heart is just an incredible portal that we can journey to. Yes. Oh, it's just been a delight being with you today, everyone. And if any ideas or things that start springing or creatively something in your being, do feel free to touch base. And those of you who are watching later in replay as well, I love to hear from folks. And I really I love seeing that cat there, Zoe. It's just been a beauty. I really hope our paths cross again in some gorgeous wild forest somewhere of mythic proportions. And yes, so thank you so much for drawing out the stories and the words today. It's been lovely being with you. So
Thank you so much.
again, thank you. Oh,
Thank you.
have
Thank you, Jackie.
a beautiful evening and a beautiful day, Zoe.
Sweet dreams, everyone.
You
Mm,
too.
you
Sweet
too.
dreams.
You too.